The multiverse is vast beyond comprehension, a sprawling architecture of realities separated by membranes thinner than the edge of a blade. Most universes never touch. Most beings never cross. But gods are not most beings. And Khonshu, the pale traveler, the embracer, the god of those who journey through the night, Marc Spector, had been watching this particular darkness for a very long time. If you want to see more crossover battles and unexpected universe collisions, hit that subscribe button and drop the name of a character and universe you'd want to see in the comments below. Let's explore the infinite together. The city was Budapest. It was always Budapest when the hidden world bled through the cracks of the human one. The Danube moved black and slow beneath a sky that hadn't seen stars in 3 days, choked with November cloud cover that pressed down over the old stone bridges and the winding streets of the Buda side like a lid on a coffin. The city smelled of cold river water, diesel exhaust, and something older underneath both. Something that most humans filtered out instinctively. The primal olfactory warning their ancestors had encoded into their DNA across 10,000 years of being prey. Iron, rot, the specific sweetness of predatory biology operating in close proximity to human populations. Marc Spector came through without a portal. There was no light, no sound, no dramatic tearing of dimensional fabric. One moment there was nothing in the narrow alley between a shuttered pharmacy and a crumbling Habsburg-era apartment building. The next moment there was a man in white crouched against the cobblestones, one knee down, gloved fingers pressed flat against the ground, head bowed as the last reverberations of Khonshu's forcible transit moved through his skeleton like a bell that had just been struck. He stayed still for 4 seconds, breathing, counting. Mark. Stephen Grant's voice, careful and precise, running an internal diagnostic the way he always did when the world stopped making sense. Mark, I don't think we're in New York anymore. No, Mark agreed quietly. He raised his head. The moon was there. That was the first thing he checked, always. The moon, his anchor, his power source, his employer's eye. It hung above the cloud layer, invisible but present, its gravitational pull a constant pressure against his sternum that he'd learned to read like a compass bearing. Full in 4 days, he was running at something less than full capacity. The lunar signal slightly muffled by whatever dimensional translation Khonshu had just dragged him through. But it was there. He wasn't blind. He wasn't powerless. He was, however, somewhere he had never been. Khonshu. He said the name flat, not a prayer, not a plea, a demand. Talk to me. The god's voice arrived the way it always did, not in his ears, but behind them, resonating in the space between thought and instinct, ancient and vast and utterly without apology. You are where you need to be, Avatar. The rest will reveal itself. That's not an answer. It is the only answer that matters at this moment. Be still. Listen. Mark listened. The alley was quiet on the surface. 2 streets over, a tram moved along its road. Somewhere above him, a window was open despite the cold, and the thin sound of a television news broadcast drifted down. Hungarian, fast, something about a series of unexplained deaths in the outer districts. His enhanced hearing, sharpened by Khonshu's gift, caught what the newsreader carefully didn't say. The bodies had been drained, not just of blood, of something less quantifiable. Life force, his instincts supplied, though the newsreader would never use those words. And then the dead started talking. This was the part that never got easier. Khonshu's divine sight, the ability to perceive the souls of those who had died in the night, travelers lost without guidance, worked differently here. In his own world, the dead appeared as shadows, as whispers, as the occasional fully formed specter drawn to his presence like moths to a candle. Here, In this city, they were everywhere. The alley alone held 7 of them, and they were not the clean grief shapes he was used to. These dead had been made wrong, torn from their bodies by violence so complete, so thorough, that whatever passed for their souls had been left ragged and confused, anchored to the physical world by the sheer traumatic incomprehension of what had happened to them. They turned toward him the moment his sight engaged, all 7 at once, with the desperate hunger of the profoundly lost. "Stephen," Marc's voice was steady. "I need you to catalog what you're seeing. Don't engage with them yet." "Right, yes." Stephen surfaced more fully, his particular gift for pattern recognition and historical context coming online. "They're... Marc, these aren't ordinary violent deaths. The energy signature on these souls, it's like something fed on them, not just killed them, consumed them on some fundamental level. I've read about this in Egyptian funerary texts, the concept of the soul being devoured rather than simply ending. Vampires, Jake Lockley said from somewhere deeper, dry and certain. The third altar didn't surface often, but when he did, it was always with that particular quality of flat, street-level pragmatism. Vampires. This city smells like a feeding ground." Marc stood up. His white suit caught the ambient light from the street beyond the alley's mouth and held it, the lunar reflective material doing what it was designed to do, making him visible, making him a beacon, making him exactly the kind of target that Khonshu had always intended his avatar to be. The crescent darts were at his wrists. The truncheons were at his hips. His head was clear, or as clear as it ever got with 3 people living in it. From the rooftop directly above him, he heard the near-silent repositioning of someone who had been trained to move without sound and had nearly succeeded. They'd been watching him since he landed. He didn't look up. He kept his posture neutral, hands visible, the body language of a man who knew he was being observed and had chosen transparency over aggression. In a city this saturated with predatory energy, with dead souls screaming silently in every shadow, with a god murmuring cryptic directives in the back of his skull, the first move mattered. "I know you're up there," Marc said conversationally to the empty alley. "I'm not your enemy, but I need information, and I'm running out of patience with the theatrical approach." 3 beats of silence, then the sound of multiple boots hitting cobblestone simultaneously, and the alley filled with figures in black, long coats, weapons raised, the specific disciplined formation of soldiers who had been doing this for a very long time. The weapons were pointed at his head, not his center mass. His head. Interesting, Marc thought. They'd encountered things that didn't stop for center mass shots before. The woman at the point of the formation had cheekbones like architecture and eyes that caught the distant streetlight and held it a half-second too long. She looked at his white suit, his crescent darts, his completely calm expression, and something shifted in her assessment. Not fear, not quite. Recalibration. "What are you?" she asked. Her English was accented, precise, and entirely without warmth, as Marc considered the question with genuine thoughtfulness. "That," he said, "is a longer conversation than this alley deserves." The woman's name, Marc would learn later, was Kova, a death dealer of 14 years, third ranked in the Budapest Coven's field operatives, responsible for the elimination of 31 Lycans and the containment of 9 human exposures. She had seen things in those 14 years that would have dismantled the sanity of any ordinary person. She had watched colleagues burned alive by Lycan ambushes, had held the line during the chaos following the antigen facility exposure, had reorganized her unit when the Coven's upper hierarchy had fractured, and left the ground-level operatives to maintain order through sheer professional discipline. She had never seen anything like the man in white. "Lower your weapons," Marc said. Not a request, not a threat. A statement of preference delivered with the calm of someone who had already calculated every exit vector and determined that violence, while available, was presently inefficient. Kova did not lower her weapon. Neither did the 5 death dealers flanking her. Their formation was tight, practiced, the overlapping fields of fire covering every angle. UV emitters charged, silver nitrate rounds chambered, the kind of loadout that had ended older and stronger things than whatever this was. "You came through the dimensional convergence point," Kova said. It wasn't a question. The Coven's scientific division had been tracking the anomalous energy readings from that alley for 6 hours, which was why her unit had been positioned on the surrounding rooftops before Marc had ever arrived. The reading suggested something supernatural was inbound. We assumed Lycan activity. I'm not a Lycan. We can see that. Her eyes moved across him with the thoroughness of someone conducting a field assessment in real time. No fangs, no Lycan scent. She would have detected that from the rooftop, the specific musk of canine biology layered over human. His heartbeat was present, steady, human in its rhythm, but wrong in its cadence. Too controlled, too deliberate, as though the man operating the body was consciously managing functions that most humans ran on autopilot. You're not a vampire. You're not a hybrid. The energy signature coming off you is something our instruments don't have a classification for. Ancient, Stephen offered internally, with the quiet satisfaction of a man whose expertise was finally relevant. Tell her, Ancient. That's the accurate word. Marc didn't tell her anything, and he was watching the formation, watching the weapons, and listening to the city around them. Because the 7 dead souls in the alley had been joined by 3 more in the last 90 seconds, all of them newer, all of them bearing that same ragged quality of violent consumption. Whatever was feeding in Budapest tonight hadn't stopped for the arrival of a dimensional anomaly. Something is actively hunting in your city right now, Marc said. 3 more deaths in the last 2 minutes, within 4 blocks of this location. Whatever your unit was supposed to be doing tonight before I showed up, you should still be doing it. The death dealers exchanged a look that passed too fast for human eyes. Marc caught it anyway. Kova's earpiece crackled. She listened for 3 seconds, and then something in her posture shifted. The micro-tension of a professional receiving bad news in the field. She made a hand signal to her unit that Marc read as hold position and took 2 steps back, her weapon still raised, her eyes still on him. "We have a confirmed Lycan incursion," she said, and the words were directed at her team, but her gaze never left Marc. "Eastern District, pack of 6, possible 7th. 2 civilian casualties confirmed. 7 Lycans," Jake said from the interior. 6 death dealers. Those are bad odds for them, and they know it. They did know it. Marc could see the math running behind Kova's eyes. Her unit against a pack of that size at night, in an urban environment where the Lycans had the advantage of transformation and the humans couldn't afford the exposure of a prolonged firefight. They were good when they were professional. But good and professional had a ceiling when the numbers were wrong. "I'll help you," Marc said. Kova's expression didn't change. "We don't accept help from unknowns. You do tonight." He reached up slowly, telegraphing every movement, and adjusted the crescent dart at his right wrist, not drawing it, just making its presence visible. "I don't know your world yet. You don't know me. That's a mutual problem, and the people dying 4 blocks east don't have time for us to resolve it through proper channels. So here's what happens. I work the engagement with you. You see what I can do, And afterward, you take me to whoever makes decisions in your organization, and we have the longer conversation. And if I say no? Then I go anyway, and we both lose the intelligence value of watching each other operate. He met her eyes, those two still eyes that held light wrong, without flinching. I'm not asking for your trust. I'm offering you a field assessment. Those are different things. 14 years of death dealer instinct ran its calculation. Kova lowered her weapon 2 inches, not holstered, not down, but the angle shifted from execute to provisional. You follow my lead. You don't engage civilians. You don't use whatever you are in a way that creates exposure. Understood. And if you turn on my unit, I won't. If you do, she said. And the flatness in her voice was the specific flatness of someone who had made promises like this before and kept every one of them. I will find a way to end you regardless of what you are. Marc respected that. He nodded once. They moved. The Eastern District was 12 minutes on foot through the old city's back corridors, the death dealers navigating the route with the ease of people who had memorized every shadow in Budapest, which, Marc realized, they probably had. Kova ran point, 2 dealers on the flanks, 2 on rear security, Marc positioned in the middle where they could watch him. He didn't object to the placement. He would have done the same. Stephen was quietly cataloging everything. The weapons, the formation discipline, the way the dealers communicated in sub-vocalized signals and hand gestures that had clearly been refined over decades. These aren't soldiers, he noted internally. There's something older than soldiers. There's an institutional memory in how they move, centuries of refinement. Predator hunters, Jake agreed, specialized, focused, good at exactly one thing. The Lycan scent hit Marc before the sounds did. A thick animal musk layered over adrenaline and the iron of fresh blood, emanating from a loading dock behind a commercial building that had been closed for the night. The death dealers registered it simultaneously, their pace shifting from fast walk to tactical approach without a spoken word. Kova raised a fist. Everyone stopped. Through the loading dock's corrugated metal wall, Marc heard 7 heartbeats. 6 running fast and hot, the metabolic signature of creatures mid-transformation or recently transformed, and 1 slower. Human, frightened, alive. He held up 1 finger. 1 survivor. Kova looked at him, genuinely surprised that he'd gotten that from 30 meters out. She held up her own hand, reorganizing the approach, and Marc watched her reassign priorities on the fly with the efficiency of a general who'd fought this war for longer than most humans lived. The doors came off their hinges 30 seconds later. The loading dock was vast and dark, and the 6 Lycans inside were large. Genuinely, architecturally large. The kind of mass that didn't register properly until it was moving toward you at speed. 2 of them turned the breach immediately, the others wheeling from the survivor they'd cornered against the far wall. The death dealers opened fire without hesitation, silver nitrate rounds crossing the space in controlled bursts, and 2 Lycans stumbled. Not stopped, stumbled, the silver doing damage but not the instant takedown that movies promised. Real Lycan biology absorbed punishment and kept generating. Marc was already moving. He crossed the distance to the nearest Lycan in 4 strides, the crescent darts leaving his wrist in a flat trajectory that caught the creature across the throat, not silver, not UV, but the edge was monomolecular, and the force behind it was lunar-enhanced, and the Lycan felt it. It spun toward him, and Marc was already inside its reach, 1 truncheon connecting with the side of its jaw at an angle calculated to use the creature's own rotational momentum against its balance, and the follow-through bringing his elbow into the back of its neck as it pitched forward. It hit the ground and didn't immediately get up. The other Lycans registered the new threat. Marc could see them recalibrating. This wasn't a death dealer. The scent was wrong. The fighting style was wrong. The energy coming off him was wrong in a way that touched something old and cautious in their animal instincts. Good. Let them be cautious. Khonshu's voice arrived like a cold wind through the back of his mind. They can smell the divine on you, Avatar. Even predators remember to fear the gods. The fight lasted 4 minutes. When it was over, 5 Lycans were down, 3 contained by the death dealers, 2 by Marc, and the 6th had retreated through a rear access panel, which Kova logged with professional irritation and marked for follow-up. The survivor was a young woman in her 20s who was going to need significant memory alteration and about 6 months of therapy she would never be able to explain to a regular therapist. Kova stood over the contained Lycans and looked across the dock at Marc. He was standing in the center of the aftermath, white suit marked with the dark evidence of the engagement, breathing normally. "You're fast," she said, "stronger than you look. And whatever energy you used to disorient them, they were afraid of it." "They should be," Marc said. She studied him for a long moment. Then she made the decision that Marc had been waiting for her to make since the alley. The decision that only came from watching someone operate and finding no reasonable alternative to a provisional trust. "Come with me," Kova said. "The Elder will want to see you." The Coven's Budapest stronghold was not a castle. Marc had half expected a castle. Stephen had specifically anticipated a castle, with the particular archaeological enthusiasm he brought to anything that promised medieval architecture and the kind of institutional history that left physical traces in stonework and stained glass. Instead, Kova led them through a series of increasingly narrow streets in the Buda side's oldest quarter until they reached what appeared to be a private bank. 4 stories of 19th century stone facade, brass fittings on the doors, the discreet signage of a financial institution that did not advertise and did not need to. The kind of establishment that existed for clients who had accumulated wealth across timescales that normal banking infrastructure wasn't designed to accommodate. The underground levels went down 6 floors. The elevator was modern, the security biometric and layered, and the death dealers who staffed the lower levels carried themselves with the specific posture of people who had been soldiers long enough that the military bearing had become skeletal, built into the bones rather than performed for the surface. They looked at Marc the way professionals looked at anything unclassified, with careful, contained attention and hands that never moved far from weapons. He was processed, not searched, because Kova had made clear that attempting to disarm him would produce complications, but documented. Cameras, scanners, on instruments he didn't have names for that moved around him on articulated arms and produced readings that made the technician operating them go very still and then immediately reach for a secure communication line. "Interesting," Stephen murmured, watching the technician's face. "Whatever those instruments measure, we're producing results they haven't seen before." "Divine energy signature," Marc said quietly, low enough that only he could hear himself. "Khonshu's mark. They're reading a god and they don't have a category for it." "I do." "Correct," Khonshu confirmed, sounding faintly pleased. "This world's supernatural taxonomy is limited to what has survived here. They know vampires. They know Lycans. They know the human sciences that have grown up around both. But they have no framework for a deity's consecrated servant, because no deity has walked this world in the way I walk mine. Not for a very long time. Were there gods here once?" A pause. The quality of Khonshu's silence was different from ordinary silence. It had texture, implication, the sense of a vast intelligence selecting what to reveal. "There were powers here once that your world might have called divine. They are gone now. What replaced them is what you see." Marc filed that away, and said nothing more. Kova brought him to a room that was clearly designed for exactly this kind of situation. A neutralized meeting space, the walls embedded with UV emitters that could flood the room in seconds, the furniture minimal and heavy and bolted, and the single exit guarded by 2 death dealers, whose weapon loadout suggested they were prepared for something significantly more dangerous than a confused human. The room said, "We talk to things we don't yet understand here, and we keep our options open." He sat. He waited. The man who came through the door 8 minutes later was not what Marc expected an Elder's representative to look like. He was slight, middle-aged in appearance, though his eyes carried the specific quality of someone for whom middle age was a generous approximation, dressed in the dark, understated clothing of a senior academic or a careful bureaucrat. He moved with the unhurried precision of someone who had learned centuries ago that urgency was a resource to be conserved. His name, he said, sitting across from Marc without preamble, was Istvan. He was the Coven's senior intelligence coordinator for Central Europe. The Elder, the singular Elder who now guided the Budapest Coven's reorganized hierarchy following the events of recent years, a vampire named Cassia, who had survived 300 years by being considerably more cautious than her predecessors, had reviewed the scanner data and dispatched Istvan to conduct a preliminary assessment. "The Elder does not meet unknowns until they are known," Istvan said. His English was perfect and completely without accent, the product of enough practice that the original language underneath it had been worn smooth. "You understand the logic." "I understand it," Marc said. "I don't have time for it." "Nevertheless." Istvan folded his hands on the table. "The readings our instruments produced when you were processed are anomalous is insufficient. Revolutionary, perhaps. You are generating an energy signature consistent with a divine source. Not magical in the sense we understand magic. Not biological, something older." He paused. "There is an Egyptian quality to it." Marc said nothing. "Our historical archives go back considerably further than most institutions," Istvan continued. "There are records, fragmentary, disputed among our scholars, of a period before the Corvinus bloodline established the current order of things. A period when other powers moved through the world. When the boundaries between what you might call divine jurisdiction and what we would call the natural supernatural order were less clearly defined." He looked at Marc with those ancient, careful eyes. "You are wearing the mark of something from that period." "Khonshu," Marc said. "No point in obscuring it. Egyptian god of the moon, travelers, those who move through the night." Istvan was quiet for a moment. "And you are his avatar?" "His fist," Marc said, which was accurate in ways that avatar wasn't. "His instrument, his occasionally unwilling employee. Why are you here?" "That's what I'm trying to find out." He leaned forward, elbows on the table, and let some of the fatigue of dimensional transit and a 4-minute Lycan engagement show in his posture. Not weakness. Just the honest accounting of a man who had been through something and was still functional. "Khonshu brought me here. He says there's something in this world he needs me to find. He's being characteristically vague about the details, which is his standard operating procedure. What I know is that it has something to do with the Corvinus bloodline, specifically a branch of it that carries markers my god apparently recognizes." Istvan's stillness took on a different quality. Not surprise. Something more careful than surprise. Recognition, possibly, of a specific kind that he was choosing not to immediately display. Marc noticed. Of course he noticed. "You know what I'm talking about," Marc said. "I know," Istvan said slowly. "Of certain historical anomalies within the Corvinus lineage that have never been satisfactorily explained by our sciences. He chose each word with the deliberateness of a man diffusing something. Certain individuals across the centuries whose biology diverged from both the vampire and Lycan expressions in ways that suggested a third influence, an older influence. The scholarship on this is suppressed. The elders historically found the implications destabilizing to the established order. A third bloodline, Marc said. A theoretical third bloodline. One that the Coven has spent 3 centuries ensuring remained theoretical. Istvan's eyes held Marc's with the directness of someone deciding, in real time, how much to trust a stranger with information that could detonate the fragile stability of their entire world. If your God brought you here because this bloodline has surfaced, if there is a living individual carrying those markers, then you should understand that you are not the only one who has been looking. The Lycans, and others. He paused. There is a Lycan elder, older than most of his kind survived to be. He has been operating independently of the main packs for the last several decades, pursuing his own research into exactly this question. His name is Valdrris. He disappeared from our surveillance network 4 months ago. Istvan's expression was the careful neutral of someone delivering information they weren't certain was wise to deliver. 3 weeks ago, one of our deep cover assets reported that Valdrris had resurfaced in Budapest, which is why this Coven's leadership has been operating at elevated alert status, and why Kova's unit was positioned near the convergence point when you arrived. Marc sat back. The picture was assembling itself with a particular clarity that came when disparate pieces of intelligence suddenly found their geometry. Khonshu had brought him here now, not a week ago, not a month ago, but now, and when a 3-century-old Lycan elder with knowledge of the third bloodline had surfaced in the same city where the convergence point had opened. That was not coincidence. Khonshu did not deal in coincidence. No, the god agreed, sounding deeply satisfied. I do not. I need to find Valdrris before your Coven does, Marc said. The elder will not permit. Istvan. Marc's voice was quiet and entirely serious. I came through a dimensional barrier because my god decided this matter required his avatar's personal attention. Whatever the third bloodline represents, whatever Khonshu wants with it, it is significant enough that a deity rearranged the geometry of reality to put me in this room, in this city, at this exact moment. He paused. Minyast, you have 3 centuries of records about what happens when the Coven tries to suppress something the divine considers its business. I'd like us to find a more productive arrangement. The intelligence coordinator looked at him for a long, measuring moment. Then, for the first time, something crossed his face that was not carefully managed neutrality. It was the expression of a very old mind, encountering a variable it had not accounted for, and finding the experience, despite everything, genuinely interesting. I will relay your position to the elder, Istvan said. In the meantime, you will remain in this facility as a guest. The word guest carried its full diplomatic weight of detained, but not yet hostile. And I will arrange for you to have access to the relevant archive materials. The suppressed scholarship. A selection of it. He rose from the table with that same unhurried grace. Consider it a gesture of provisional cooperation. Marc watched him go and turned the new information over in his mind. The third bloodline, Valdrris, the suppressed records, Khonshu's deliberate silence on the details. Somewhere in this city, a Lycan elder who had spent decades chasing the same question was running his own operation. And somewhere in this city, a person was walking around carrying divine markers in their blood that 2 immortal factions and one Egyptian god, all apparently considered worth going to significant lengths to acquire. That person, Marc thought with a specific empathy of someone who had spent his entire life being sought after by powers larger than himself, was having a very bad time and probably didn't know why. He intended to find them first. The archives were kept on the 5th sublevel, in a climate-controlled vault that smelled of preservation chemicals and the specific dusty quality of documents that had been handled carefully for centuries. The death dealer assigned to escort Marc there, a young-looking vampire named Doran, who had the watchful economy of movement that suggested he was significantly older than his face implied, led him through a series of security checkpoints without conversation, and deposited him in a reading room adjacent to the vault with a tablet loaded with digitized documents and a single instruction. The physical materials were not to be touched without a Coven archivist present. Marc sat down and began reading. Istvan took over within 30 seconds. With the focused intensity of a man who had spent his mortal life in a museum and his immortal life in combat, and had never stopped grieving the gap between the two. He read quickly, cross-referencing, building the internal architecture of the information with the systematic precision that was his particular gift among the three of them. Marc let him work. Jake stayed quiet in the way Jake was always quiet, present, observant, cataloging threats and exits and the position of Doran's weapon hand with the patient attention of a man who expected violence and simply hadn't assigned it a timeline yet. The documents were extraordinary. The suppressed scholarship on the 3rd Corvinus bloodline spanned 4 centuries of Coven research, most of it conducted in secret by individual scholars whose work had been confiscated and classified at the elder level. The earliest records dated to the late 17th century. A Coven scientist named Petrescu, who had identified anomalous biological markers in 3 separate individuals across a 40-year period, and had been, judging by the abrupt termination of his research notes, silenced before he could complete his analysis. Later researchers had picked up threads of the same work and arrived at similar conclusions before meeting similar fates. The institutional suppression so thorough that each successive scholar had been unaware of their predecessors, forced to rediscover the same evidence from scratch. What they had all found, working independently across hundreds of years, was consistent. Know the Corvinus bloodline, the original source code of all vampire and Lycan biology, the genetic legacy of Alexander Corvinus, whose unique mutation had produced the first immortals, was not binary. The historical record assumed 2 expressions. The vampire strain passed through one son, the Lycan strain through another. The 3rd son, mortal, had been considered irrelevant, the branch that hadn't activated, the dead end of an extraordinary family tree. But the 3rd son had not been entirely ordinary. Istvan sat very still with that realization, the scholar in him processing implications with the speed of someone who could hold large conceptual structures in his head and turn them. The 3rd Corvinus son had carried the mutation in a dormant state, not activated into vampire or Lycan biology, on not conferring immortality or transformation, but present. And across the centuries, as his descendants had multiplied and dispersed, occasional individuals had presented with the dormant mutation in a form that was not quite dormant anymore. Not vampire, not Lycan, something that the Coven's instruments registered as a 3rd category, a biological expression of the Corvinus mutation that had never been allowed to fully develop because every time it appeared, the Coven buried it. And running through the biological marker, the specific protein sequence that all the suppressed researchers had identified as the 3rd expression signature, was something that Petrescu in 1687 had described as a divine resonance, something that his instruments, primitive by modern standards, had registered as fundamentally different from the immortal biology of vampires and Lycans. Something ancient. Something that did not originate with Alexander Corvinus at all, but seemed to have been present in the bloodline even before his mutation activated. As though the Corvinus family had been, at some point in their deep history, touched by something that was not human and not supernatural in the underworld sense. Something divine. Yes, Khonshu said, and his voice carried a quality Marc had rarely heard in it. Something that was not quite reverence, but was adjacent to it. The recognition of one ancient power encountering the traces of another. Now you begin to understand why I brought you here. Talk, Marc said, low enough that only he heard it. Now, fully, no more fragments. The god was quiet for a moment. The deliberate quiet of a being organizing a disclosure it had been withholding. When he spoke, his voice had lost its usual imperious texture and taken on something older and more careful. Before the Corvinus bloodline existed, before the immortal war that shaped this world, there was a period when the divine powers moved more freely between what you call universes. The boundaries were thinner. My jurisdiction, the night, the travelers, those who move between states of being, extended here as it extended to many places. I had no avatar in this world, no worship, no temple, but I had presence. You touched someone, Marc said. Not an accusation, a reading, a family. Many generations before the name Corvinus had meaning. I marked them, not as my servants, not as my instruments. It was simply as mine, in the way that a god marks those who have moved through his domain and been found worthy. It was a small thing, a thread of divine resonance woven into their blood. I did not anticipate that the resonance would survive across so many centuries, or that it would interact with a mutation as powerful as the one that later appeared in their line. Stephen had gone very still in the interior, processing this with the expression of a man watching a cathedral reveal its hidden architecture. The third expression, he said quietly. It's not just a biological variant. It's the Corvinus mutation activating in combination with Khonshu's mark. The divine resonance is the third ingredient. That's why it presents differently. It's not purely immortal biology. It's immortal biology with a god's fingerprint on it. The individual who carries this expression fully activated, Khonshu continued, would be something this world has not seen. Neither vampire nor Lycan. Something older, something capable of perceiving and moving through the boundaries between states of being, life and death, human and immortal, the mortal world and what lies beyond it, in ways that neither faction's biology allows. And you want them, Marc said flatly. I want them to understand what they are. I want the resonance to be acknowledged. I am a god who has been absent from this world for centuries, Avatar. The thread of my mark surviving this long, finding its expression in a living person. That is not nothing. That is you wanting something, Marc said, and using me to get it, not like always. Khonshu did not deny this. Marc closed his eyes for 2 seconds, running the full moral topology of the situation. The suppressed person out there carrying biology that 2 immortal factions wanted to weaponize or eliminate. A god who wanted to claim them for reasons that were probably not entirely benevolent, and his own position as the instrument of that god's agenda in a world that wasn't his. The ethics were not clean. They were never clean. But the person was out there, vulnerable, unaware, most likely, of what they were or why they were being hunted. And whatever Khonshu's ultimate agenda was, Marc's personal position on finding someone who was being hunted by multiple factions and making sure they had a choice in what happened next. That position was non-negotiable. But he was still processing this when the reading room door opened and Doran appeared, his carefully managed expression showing the first crack of genuine urgency. "You need to come," the young old vampire said. "Now." Marc stood. "What happened?" "The Lycan elder, Valdrris." Doran's hand had moved to his weapon with the unconscious instinct of a soldier receiving bad news. "He's been located. He's not alone." Pause. "And he's not in the city anymore. He moved 3 hours ago while you were." The crack in his composure widened slightly. "He has someone with him. Our surveillance footage from the transit hub shows a young woman, early 20s, human appearance. But the passive scanners at the hub flagged her biological signature." Marc was already moving toward the door. "It's the third bloodline." "The readings were off our instrument's scale," Doran said, falling into step beside him with the automatic adjustment of someone who had reassigned their position from guard to escort without consciously deciding to. "We've never seen a reading like it. Not in 400 years of monitoring the Corvinus variants." He paused. "Whatever she is, she's more activated than any previous expression we've recorded." "Where did Valdrris take her?" "South, toward the Serbian border." Doran's jaw was tight. "The Elder has authorized a full retrieval operation. 12 death dealers, 2 vehicles, air support." He looked at Marc sideways, the look of a soldier acknowledging a variable his chain of command hadn't fully accounted for. "Kova requested you be included in the briefing." Marc thought about the young woman in the transit hub footage he hadn't seen yet. Moving through a busy public space with a centuries-old Lycan elder, probably believing she was being helped, probably having no framework yet for what was in her blood or why it mattered. He thought about Khonshu's confession and the suppressed centuries of research and the careful, systematic way this world's power structures dealt with anything that didn't fit their binary. He thought about what it felt like to carry something divine in your blood and have no say in what it meant. "I'll be at the briefing," Marc said. "But I need you to understand something before we walk into that room." Doran looked at him. "I'm not a death dealer. I'm not Coven. And whatever the Elder's retrieval operation intends to do with this woman once she's found, that conversation is happening with me present, and my position on it is going to be heard." He held the vampire's gaze with the steady directness of someone making a commitment rather than a threat. "Make sure Kova knows that before we sit down." Doran studied him for a moment with those ancient, careful eyes. Then he gave a single nod. The nod of a professional acknowledging a complication that had been present from the beginning and was now simply making itself explicit. They walked toward the briefing room. And somewhere south of Budapest, a young woman who didn't know she was the most significant person in 2 universes was riding in a car with a Lycan elder who had spent 40 years looking for her, heading toward a border that neither of them would reach without consequences. The briefing room held 12 death dealers, 1 intelligence coordinator, 1 ancient vampire's holographic presence, and Marc Spector. And the geometry of who stood where said everything about the fault lines running through the room before a single word was spoken. Kova stood at the front, mission maps spread across the tactical display, her unit arranged behind her with the disciplined attention of people who had operated together long enough that their positioning was instinctive. Istvan stood to the side, the careful neutral of an intelligence professional maintaining equidistance from all positions. The holographic elder, Cassia, 300 years of survival distilled into a face of extraordinary composed authority, occupied the display screen at the room's head with the particular quality of presence that very old and very powerful things projected even through technology. Marc stood near the door, not because he was uncertain, because standing near the door was information. It told the room that he was here by choice, that his participation was volitional, that the briefing's assumptions about his role needed to account for a man who could leave and was choosing not to. Jake had suggested the position. Jake was usually right about rooms. Cassia spoke first. Her voice through the speakers was measured and precise, the accent layered with centuries of linguistic sediment. Hungarian underneath Austro-Hungarian, underneath something older that Marc's ear couldn't fully parse. "The asset's designation in our records is Variant Omega," she said, without preamble. "She is 23 years old. Her name, as far as our surveillance has established, is Nadia Voss. German-Hungarian parentage, currently residing in Vienna, arrived in Budapest 6 days ago under circumstances our analysts are still reconstructing. The holographic display shifted to surveillance footage, a young woman moving through Budapest's Keleti station, dark-haired, unremarkable in appearance, carrying a single bag with the body language of someone who had been in transit long enough that the weight of it had become invisible. Beside her, slightly behind, a heavy-set older man whose movement pattern was wrong in the specific way of someone managing the constant low-level effort of suppressing a biology that wanted to be something larger. Valdrris. Marc studied him. The Lycan elder was perhaps 60 in appearance, white-haired, broad-shouldered, moving with the contained power of something that had spent decades learning to compress itself into human dimensions. His face carried the particular stillness of extreme age in a being designed for violence. Not the stillness of peace, but the stillness of perfect control. Every instinct and impulse routed through a discipline refined over centuries. He moved close to the young woman, but not threateningly. The body language somewhere between protective and proprietary, in a way that Marc read immediately as complicated. Valdrris had found her first, and whatever he'd told her, she'd gone with him willingly. Valdrris has been pursuing the third expression for 40 years, Istvan said, taking over the intelligence briefing with the smooth coordination of a practiced team. His research predates any of our current surveillance architecture. He was at various points a subject of Coven interest himself. His longevity exceeds normal Lycan parameters by a significant margin, which our analysts attributed to an unusually pure genetic line. We now believe his longevity may itself be related to trace amounts of the third expression present in his own biology, insufficient to produce the full variant, but enough to extend his lifespan and sharpen his instincts beyond normal Lycan capacity. He's part of it, Stephen said internally, with the quiet excitement of someone watching a pattern complete itself. Not a full expression, but adjacent to it. That's why he's been searching. He recognized something in himself that he couldn't explain and spent 40 years trying to find its source. He's not just hunting her, Marc said aloud. The room looked at him. He's been looking for an explanation for his own biology. She's not a target to him, she's an answer. Kova's expression was carefully neutral. His motivations don't change our operational parameters. They change mine, Marc said. Cassia's holographic presence shifted its attention to him with the full focus of something that had survived 3 centuries by paying absolute attention to variables that threatened her world's stability. "Mr. Spector, you have been extended provisional hospitality based on your cooperation in last night's field engagement and the extraordinary nature of your arrival in our world. I want to be clear about the limits of that hospitality." "I'd appreciate that," Marc said, entirely genuinely. Variant Omega, Nadia Voss, represents a biological and strategic reality that this Coven cannot permit to exist outside our oversight. Not because we wish her harm. The elder's voice carried the specific weight of a being making a statement it had made many times before and believed entirely. Because what she carries, fully expressed, will draw attention from every faction in this world that monitors anomalous supernatural activity. The Lycan packs, the remaining Coven networks across Europe, and powers beyond both that operate at a level most field operatives never encounter. A pause. She requires protection, controlled introduction to her own biology, guidance through an activation process that, unmanaged, will be physically and psychologically catastrophic. All of which you will provide, Marc said, under Coven oversight, with Coven interests informing every decision about her future. Those interests are not incompatible with her well-being. They're not identical to it either. The room was very quiet. Kova was watching Marc with the expression of a professional recalculating a variable she had thought she understood. Doran, standing near the back, had the look of someone watching a negotiation that could go several ways and had not yet revealed which. Cassia studied him through the screen with 3 centuries of evaluative intelligence. You have an alternative proposal. I have a condition, Marc said. I go in first, ahead of the retrieval team. I make contact with Nadia Voss before your death dealers surround her vehicle, and she spends the next decade believing she was kidnapped by vampires. He held the Elder's gaze through the screen, God-marked eyes meeting ancient immortal ones across the distance of a camera feed. She gets to hear what she is from someone who isn't a faction, someone who doesn't want to own her or weaponize her or suppress her, and then she gets to make a choice about what comes next. And if she chooses Valdrris, then we deal with that, Marc said. But she chooses. That's non-negotiable. The silence stretched for 8 seconds. Marc counted them. It was Kova who spoke first, and her voice carried the careful weight of someone making a professional judgment that her commanding elder had not yet made explicit. The asset is currently in a vehicle on the E75 southbound. At current speed, she crosses the Serbian border in approximately 4 hours. Once she's out of EU jurisdiction, our operational parameters become significantly more complicated. She looked at the Elder's image on the screen. A single operative making initial contact carries substantially less exposure risk than a full retrieval team. If contact goes well, we lose nothing. If it goes poorly, Marc said. I'm the one who bears the consequence, not your people. Cassia was quiet for a long moment. The quality of her stillness was different from the death dealer's stillness, deeper, more geological. The patience of something that had learned to make decisions across timescales that made urgency feel like a human indulgence. You have 2 hours ahead of the retrieval team, she said finally. Not because I am persuaded by your argument, Mr. Spector. Because the God whose mark you carry has survived long enough that I consider his judgment, however obliquely expressed, worth a degree of operational deference. The Elder's eyes were very old and very direct. Do not mistake this for trust, and do not mistake my restraint for weakness. I wouldn't, Marc said, and he meant it. Kova gave him a vehicle, a black SUV, with the kind of understated functionality that suggested it had been modified for exactly the kind of pursuit that didn't appear on any official record. She gave him Nadia Voss's last confirmed position and a secure comm frequency and a look that contained several things she wasn't saying. The most significant of which was something between professional respect and the very specific concern of someone who had just watched a man walk voluntarily into a situation with too many moving parts. The Lycan Elder is not going to welcome your approach, she said, standing at the underground garage's exit. I know. He has spent 40 years protecting this particular mission. He will not distinguish between the Coven sending someone and a dimensional anomaly making independent contact. She paused. He is very old and very capable, and he has nothing left to lose. Most dangerous combination there is, Jake said internally, with the flat appreciation of a man who recognized his own category. Marc got in the vehicle. The E75 south of Budapest was a long gray tongue of motorway running through flat agricultural land. The November fields stripped and brown on both sides. The sky the color of old concrete, pressing down toward a horizon that offered nothing. Marc drove at the kind of speed that was technically illegal and practically invisible at 3 in the morning on a road this empty. The SUV's modified engine eating distance with quiet efficiency. Khonshu was present but silent, the god's attention a constant pressure at the back of Marc's skull, focused south. The divine compass pointing toward the thread of his own ancient resonance moving away down the road ahead. "You could tell me more," Marc said to the silence. "About what Nadia is going to experience when this activates fully. About what you actually want from her. About whether your intentions toward her are something I should be comfortable facilitating. What I want," Khonshu said slowly, "is for what is mine to be acknowledged. The resonance in her blood is my mark, not a weapon, not a tool, a recognition. She carries evidence that I existed in this world, that I touched lives here before the immortal war consumed everything. I want her to know that. I want her to have the choice of what to do with that knowledge. And if she rejects it, then she rejects it." A pause. "I am many things, Avatar. I am not in the habit of forcing devotion. Forced devotion is worthless to a god." Marc drove and thought about that, and found it, cautiously, provisionally, something he could work with. 40 minutes south of Budapest, his headlights caught the reflection of a vehicle pulled to the side of the road ahead. A dark sedan, one tire flat, hazard lights blinking their patient orange rhythm into the empty night. Standing beside it, a heavy-set older man with white hair and the specific stillness of someone who had heard Marc's vehicle from 2 kilometers away and had been deciding what to do about it ever since. Valdrris. Beside him, half visible in the sedan's shadow, a young woman who didn't know yet that her blood was a centuries-old argument between 2 species and a god. Marc pulled over, cut the engine, sat for a moment with his hands visible on the wheel, giving Valdrris the visual information of a man making a deliberate choice not to reach for weapons. Then he got out. The cold hit immediately. The specific sharp cold of Central European November at 3 in the morning, the kind that found the gap between collar and jaw and settled there with quiet persistence. His breath misted. The motorway was empty in both directions, the flat fields on either side dissolving into darkness. The only light the hazard blink and the distant ambient glow of a sky that reflected a city somewhere behind them. Valdrris was watching him with eyes that caught the hazard light and held it longer than human eyes should. The Lycan elder's assessment was rapid, thorough, and arrived at its conclusion within 3 seconds. Whatever he found in Marc's scent, his posture, the energy coming off him, it produced an expression that was not fear and not aggression, but the specific alertness of something very old encountering something it had no category for. "You're not Coven," Valdrris said. His voice was deep, accented with something older than modern Hungarian, the linguistic sediment of centuries. "No," Marc said. "You're not Lycan. You're not human." The old eyes narrowed. "Oh, what you are smells like nothing in this world." "That's accurate," Marc said. He kept his hands visible and his posture open and his voice at the register of a man having a conversation rather than initiating a confrontation. "My name is Marc Spector. I came here from somewhere else. and I need to talk to the young woman behind you before the people who sent me 2 hours ago arrive with 12 soldiers and a mandate to bring her in." Valdrris was very still for a long moment. Behind him, Nadia Voss had stepped out of the shadow of the sedan, and Marc got his first direct look at her. Dark eyes wide and alert, processing the scene with the rapid assessment of someone whose instincts had been running hot for days without her understanding why. She was frightened, but not panicking, which suggested either unusual composure or the specific numbness of someone who had been frightened continuously long enough that the emotion had found its ceiling. "Who are you?" she asked. Her English carried a Viennese edge. Marc looked at her. This young woman carrying a god's fingerprint in her blood, standing on a dark motorway between a centuries-old predator and a dimensional refugee in a white suit at 3 a.m, with the clock running, and told her the truth. "I'm someone who thinks you deserve to hear what you are from someone who isn't trying to own it," he said. "And I have about 90 minutes before that stops being an option." Nadia Voss had known something was wrong with her for approximately 8 months. Not wrong in the way that sent people to doctors, not illness, not injury, not the quantifiable wrongness of biology failing its basic functions. Wrong in the way that sent people to the edges of things, to the margins of their own lives, where the ordinary explanations stopped working and the extraordinary ones hadn't yet revealed themselves. She had begun seeing things in October of the previous year. Not hallucinations. She was precise about this distinction, had turned it over enough times to be certain. Not things that weren't there. Things that were there but that no one else appeared to register. Shadows that moved with too much intention. People on the street whose eyes caught light in ways that human eyes didn't. The specific sensation, riding public transit or walking through crowds, of being watched by something that wasn't using eyes. She told Marc this standing beside Valdriss's disabled sedan on the E75. Her arms crossed against the cold, her dark eyes moving between Marc and the old Lycan, with the careful triangulation of someone who had learned in the last 6 days that the world contained things she hadn't been equipped to understand and was working very hard to catch up. Valdrris had not told her everything. He had told her enough that she was different, that her biology was unusual, that there were people who would consider her difference something to be controlled rather than understood. He had told her about the Coven and the Lycans and the immortal war in broad strokes. On the way you told someone a history when you needed them to understand the present without having time to teach the full curriculum. He had not told her about the third expression, or what it meant, or why 40 years of his life had been organized around finding her. Marc could see the gap in what she knew. It was visible in the questions she hadn't asked yet, the ones she was holding back because she sensed they had answers that would change everything. "Valdrris," Marc said, keeping his voice even. His attention split between the Lycan elder and the young woman with the precision of someone managing multiple threat and trust variables simultaneously. "I'm not here to take her from you. I'm here because she needs the full picture, and I think you know she doesn't have it yet." The old Lycan's eyes were steady and ancient and gave nothing away. "You said you came from somewhere else, another world." "Yes. And your God, whatever you carry, it recognizes what she is." "More than recognizes," Marc said. "He put it there, generations ago, before your bloodline's mutation activated. The divine resonance in her biology is his mark, a thread he wove into her family line centuries before Alexander Corvinus existed." He watched Valdriss's face for the reaction, and what he found was not surprise. It was the specific expression of a man hearing confirmation of something he had theorized for decades and never been able to prove. "You already suspected this." "I suspected something divine," Valdrris said slowly. My research into the third expression kept arriving at the same terminus, a quality in the biology that our sciences couldn't account for. Something that predated the Corvinus mutation entirely. I didn't know which god. I didn't know from which tradition. His eyes moved to Marc with a precision that was both intellectual and predatory. Egyptian, Khonshu, moon, night travelers, the passage between states of being. Valdrris was quiet for a moment, and Marc watched him process this with the thoroughness of someone who had spent 40 years building a theoretical framework and was now receiving the final piece that either completed it or dismantled it. His expression suggested it completed it. And underneath the intellectual resolution, something more personal, the relief, quiet and old, as of a question that had defined most of a very long life, finally finding its answer. "You said she doesn't have the full picture," Nadia said. Her voice was controlled, the control of someone who had decided that composure was the only tool available to her in a situation where everything else was uncertain. She was looking at Marc with the directness of someone who had been carefully managing partial information for 6 days and had reached the limit of what partial information could sustain. "Tell me the rest." Marc looked at her for a moment. Then he told her. He told her about the Corvinus bloodline and its 3 expressions, the vampire strain, the Lycan strain, and the 3rd branch that the Coven had suppressed for 3 centuries because its existence complicated the binary order their world had organized itself around. He told her about the dormant mutation expressing itself through Khonshu's divine resonance, about what the suppressed scholarship described as the 3rd expression's potential, the ability to perceive and move through the boundaries between states, between life and death, between human and immortal, between the visible world and what existed alongside it. He told her about the Coven's retrieval operation and the 90-minute window and the Elders' stated intention to provide protection and guidance under Coven oversight. He did not editorialize on the Elders' intentions. He gave her the information and let her evaluate it. When he finished, the motorway was quiet except for the hazard light's patient rhythm and the distant sound of wind moving across flat fields. Nadia was silent for 30 seconds. Then she said, "The things I've been seeing, the shadows, the people with the wrong eyes." "You're perceiving the immortal world," Marc said. "Your biology has been activating gradually. What you've been interpreting as something wrong with your perception is actually something right with it. You're seeing what's actually there. And the full activation will be significant," Marc said honestly. "I won't tell you it won't be difficult. From what the research describes, the 3rd expression activating fully is transformative in ways that will require support, guidance, someone who understands what's happening. The Coven says they can provide that. They can," Marc said. "The question is what it costs." Nadia looked at Valdrris. The Lycan elder met her eyes with something that Marc read carefully. Not the look of a handler managing an asset, not the possessiveness of a faction player protecting a strategic resource. Something older and more personal. The look of a man who had spent 40 years searching for evidence that his own inexplicable nature had a source, and had found in this young woman not just the answer to that question, but something adjacent to kinship. The recognition of shared strangeness. It complicated things. It made Valdrris harder to read as simply the opposition. "You're part of it too," Marc said to the old Lycan. Not a question. Valdrris inclined his head slightly. "Trace amounts, insufficient to produce the full expression. Sufficient to extend my lifespan past normal Lycan parameters and give me instincts that my pack elders never understood." A pause. "I found the first evidence of the 3rd expression in my own biology when I was perhaps 150 years old. I spent the next 4 decades trying to understand it. And then I spent 4 decades more trying to find another expression, a full one, to understand what I carried in diluted form. "You found me 3 weeks ago," Nadia said to him. Her voice was not accusing. It was the careful tone of someone recalibrating a relationship in light of new information. "I found evidence of your activation 3 weeks ago," Valdrris said. "The specific energy signature, I had been monitoring for it for years. When the instruments registered a reading in Vienna, He stopped, started again. "I came to you because I wanted you to have the information before the Coven found it. Because I know what the Coven does with things it doesn't understand and can't classify." His jaw tightened. "I know because I watched them do it to others. 3 times across my life, I found evidence of partial expressions, people carrying traces of the 3rd bloodline, not full activations, but enough to register. The Coven found 2 of them before I could. Neither was heard from again. The motorway was very quiet. Marc felt the moral geometry of the situation shift under the new weight of that information. The Coven's elder had said the suppression was historical, past policy, not present intention. Cassia had been careful and measured about her intentions toward Nadia. But careful and measured and 300 years of institutional behavior were different categories, and in Valdris's testimony carried the specific authority of direct witness. "What happened to the 3rd one?" Marc asked. "I got there first," Valdrris said simply. And they lived." The old Lycan held Marc's gaze. "They're in their 70s now. A retired schoolteacher in Bratislava who remembers nothing of what she was because she never activated fully, and I made sure she never had reason to. She has grandchildren." A pause. "That was 30 years ago. I made a different calculation then. Suppression was protection. I'm not certain I still believe that." Marc looked at Nadia. "What do you want?" The question landed in the silence and sat there. Both Valdrris and Nadia looked at him, surprised perhaps by the directness of it, by the fact that the question was being asked at all, rather than the decision being made around her by the people with more information and longer histories. "I want to understand what I am," she said. Quietly. "Certainly. I want the activation to happen with support rather than alone. And I want..." She stopped, looked at the empty fields. "I want to not spend the rest of my life being managed by people who see me as a variable in their war." "Then that's what we're going to try to get you," Marc said. He was reaching for his secure comm to call Kova when Khonshu's voice arrived with a quality he had never heard in it before. Sharp, urgent, stripped of its usual imperious architecture. "Marc, the vehicle behind us. 2 kilometers, moving fast." Marc turned. The headlights were distant but wrong, too many of them, too bright. Nor the specific configuration of vehicles that weren't traveling but converging. And above, barely audible over the wind, the sound of rotor blades. Not Coven. The Coven's retrieval team was 90 minutes out. These were not the Coven's vehicles. These were moving with the specific organized aggression of something that had been tracking Nadia's activation signal and had decided that the window for careful approach had closed. Valdrris had heard them 30 seconds before Marc spoke and was already moving, not away, but forward, putting himself between Nadia and the approaching headlights with the unhesitating instinct of something shifting from human presentation to its actual nature. "Lycan pack," he said, his voice dropping into a register that was no longer quite human. "Young leadership, radical faction. They've been tracking her activation for weeks. They want the 3rd expression for the same reason the Coven does." but their methods are considerably less measured. Marc's truncheons were in his hands. The crescent darts were live at his wrists. He felt the moon above the cloud cover. 4 days from full, its power a pressure against his sternum, Khonshu's signal strengthening now with the urgency of the moment, the divine channel opening wider under the stimulus of genuine threat. "How many?" Marc asked. 8 vehicles, Valdrris said. "Estimate 30. He looked at Marc sideways, the look of a Lycan elder assessing an unknown quantity in a combat context, calculating whether the man in white was an asset or a liability in the next 5 minutes. What he found in Marc's expression apparently resolved the question. "Can you fight?" Marc looked at the approaching headlights, the helicopter silhouette emerging from the low clouds, the organized aggression of 30 Lycans bearing down on a flat motorway in the middle of the night. He thought about Nadia standing behind them, carrying a god's fingerprint in her blood, about Valdrris with his centuries of careful protection, about the Coven 90 minutes away and the window closing fast. He rolled his neck once. "Yes," he said, "I can fight." The first vehicle hit the roadblock position at 90 kilometers per hour, and Valdrris stopped it with his hands. Not metaphorically. The Lycan elder stepped into the road, planted his feet, and caught the front of the lead SUV with both palms flat against the hood. And the vehicle crumpled around him like aluminum foil meeting a wall, the engine block compressing, the chassis buckling upward, the momentum dying against the immovable fact of what Valdrris was when he stopped pretending to be something smaller. He hadn't transformed. He didn't need to. A century and a half of Lycan biology running at its absolute ceiling, refined by trace amounts of divine resonance, produced something that looked human, only in the most technical sense. The doors of the crumpled vehicle opened, and the occupants came out fast. Young, hard-eyed, and moving with the fluid aggression of Lycans, who had spent enough time in their transformed state that the human shape felt like a costume they were tolerating. 4 of them. The ones in the vehicles behind were still disembarking, the helicopter banking low overhead, its spotlight finding the motorway and turning the scene into a stage. Marc was already moving. The lunar channel was open and running clean. Khonshu's signal finding its full frequency now, the 4 days from full moon above the clouds pressing its power through the overcast like light through paper. Not the blinding clarity of full lunar empowerment, but something close enough. Marc felt it in his joints and his reflexes, and the specific clarity of combat perception that Khonshu's gift provided. The world slowing to its component parts, trajectories becoming visible, and the geometry of the engagement presenting itself with the clean legibility of a diagram. 3 of the 4 Lycans from the lead vehicle came at him, and 1 went for Nadia. Marc put a crescent dart through the shoulder of the one heading for Nadia at 30 meters, the monomolecular edge punching clean through tissue and lodging in the joint. Not fatal, not intended to be, but producing the specific mechanical interruption of a shoulder that no longer functioned at full rotation. The Lycan stumbled, caught itself, reassessed, looked at Marc with a sudden recalibration of something that had expected a human and found something else. The other 3 didn't recalibrate. They came. The first one was fast, genuinely architecturally fast. Lycan speed in the human form being one of the most dangerous things in this world's supernatural taxonomy, the kind of velocity that made human reaction times irrelevant. Marc wasn't running on human reaction times. He stepped inside the reach of the first strike with the lateral movement of someone who had trained under a god's supervision and fought things that moved faster than most humans could perceive. Let the momentum carry the Lycan past him, and brought one truncheon across the back of its knee in a strike calculated to interrupt the joint's load-bearing function without permanent damage. The second came in low, going for his legs. Marc jumped, not the modest jump of enhanced human athletics, but the full lunar-assisted vertical of Khonshu's avatar, clearing the Lycan's tackle by 2 meters, each of the white suit catching the helicopter's spotlight as he rose, and coming back down with both truncheons descending in a crossed strike to the base of the Lycan's neck that drove it face first into the tarmac. The third stopped. It was watching him with the specific stillness of a predator that had just received new information about what it was dealing with. Behind its eyes, Marc could see the animal intelligence processing the revision. Not human, not vampire, not Lycan. Something that moved through the night with the ease of something that belonged to it. Something that smelled of old power and divine claim. They feel it, Khonshu said with satisfaction, as the others did. The night knows its master. Don't get smug, Marc said under his breath, and threw a crescent dart that caught the hesitating Lycan across the forearm in a shallow cut that stung rather than damaged. A message rather than an injury. Back off. Reassess. The Lycan backed off. The remaining vehicles had deployed now, 7 of them, their occupants spreading across the motorway in the organized aggression of a pack operation that had been planned. 26 Lycans in human form, the helicopter above providing coordination and light, the operation designed to overwhelm through numbers rather than individual power. At the back of the formation, Marc registered 2 figures who had not deployed from vehicles but had arrived differently. From the fields on either side of the road, moving through the dead November grass with the low, purposeful gait of something that hadn't bothered with the human form at all, on full transformation. 2 of them, large. Valdrris had dispatched 3 of the initial 4 and was currently holding the attention of 6 more. His augmented biology producing a fighting style that was neither pure human nor full Lycan, but something in between. The precision and tactical intelligence of a century and a half of combat experience, married to the physical capacity of a Lycan elder who had decided the situation warranted removing his governor. He was bleeding from 2 cuts that were already closing, and the 6 Lycans surrounding him were maintaining careful distance, which said everything about how the last 30 seconds had gone for anyone who had tried to close that distance. But 26-2, with 2 transformed elders coming in from the flanks, was not sustainable math. Marc looked at the approaching transformed Lycans, each one the size of a vehicle, moving through the broken field with the ground-eating lope of something built for exactly this terrain and exactly this darkness, and made a rapid decision about resource allocation. "Nadia," he called, not turning from the main formation. "Get behind the sedan. Stay low. Don't move unless I tell you." "I can help," she said. Her voice was shaking slightly, but her eyes, when Marc caught them in his peripheral vision, were focused and present, not shut down, processing. "Not yet," Marc said, "and not like this." He held her gaze for 1 second. "Trust me for 5 minutes." She moved behind the sedan. Marc turned to face the 2 transformed Lycans and let Khonshu's channel open to its current maximum. The effect was visible, not a dramatic display of divine light, nothing so theatrical. It was subtler and, in its subtlety, more unsettling. The shadows around Marc deepened and oriented toward him, the ambient darkness of the motorway gathering with the specific purposefulness of a medium responding to a signal. The moon's light, filtered through dense cloud cover, found the reflective surface of his suit and held there, producing a quality of illumination that was geometrically wrong. The light coming from him rather than falling on him, the white suit becoming its own source, pale and cold and ancient. The transformed Lycans slowed. They were enormous up close, 3 meters of restructured biology. The Lycan transformation taking the human form and expanding it into something that the human blueprint was clearly a compressed version of. muscle mass and bone density and sensory apparatus all running at their full intended scale. Their eyes in the darkness were amber and fixed on Marc with the predatory attention of things that had never encountered anything they couldn't eventually kill, but they had slowed. Marc walked toward them. Not ran, walked. The deliberate pace of something that didn't need to hurry, that owned the ground it was moving across. The moonlight gathered around him in that wrong, sourceless way. His truncheons were out. His crescent darts were live. And underneath the combat mechanics, Khonshu's presence was a cold weight at the back of his skull. The god of the night lending his avatar the specific quality that made predators pause. The recognition, at some level below conscious thought, meant that the hierarchy of the darkness had an occupant that outranked them. The first transformed Lycan swiped at him with a forelimb the size of a small table. Marc ducked under it, drove a truncheon into the joint of the elbow with the full force of lunar-enhanced strength. The crack of impact reverberating up his arm, the Lycan's forelimb buckling, and came up inside its reach with the second truncheon raking across the bridge of its nose. The nose was sensitive, even in transformation. The Lycan reared back, shaking its head, the disruption of its sensory apparatus producing momentary disorientation. Marc used the moment. He drove both truncheons in a rapid vertical sequence into the transformed Lycan's sternum. 1, 2, 3. Each strike carrying the full accumulated momentum of Khonshu's lunar gift, with the divine strength that turned Marc Spector from a very good fighter into something that large supernatural predators needed to think carefully about. The Lycan went down on one knee. Not out. Down. The second transformed Lycan hit him from the side. It was a clean tackle, 800 kilograms of transformed Lycan catching Marc at full lateral velocity, and even Khonshu's empowerment had limits. Marc went airborne, crossed 15 meters, landed on the tarmac in a controlled roll that absorbed most of the impact, but not all of it. He came up on one knee, one hand down, tasting copper, the suit's armor having taken the majority of what would otherwise have been catastrophic structural damage to his ribcage. He assessed. Bruised ribs, possibly one cracked, nothing that stopped function. The lunar channel was still open, still running. Khonshu's power compensating for the biological shock with the specific urgency of a god who had invested too much in his avatar to lose him to a single tackle. Up, Khonshu said, with the flat, non-negotiable quality of a deity who did not recognize rest as a category. Marc got up. The main formation had closed the distance while he'd been handling the transformed Lycans, 23 remaining operatives spreading into a semicircle that was designed to be a closing arc, the helicopter above tracking movement and presumably relaying positions to someone coordinating the operation. Valdrris was still standing, but bleeding more freely now, the closing numbers having found their toll even on a Lycan elder of his generation. Marc ran the math quickly. The math was not good. Then the math changed. The Coven's vehicles came from the north at a speed that turned them from headlights into physical facts within approximately 4 seconds. 3 black SUVs and a tactical van, deploying at the edge of the engagement with the smooth, practiced efficiency of a unit that had been running at elevated alert status for days and had been watching the firefight develop on the helicopter's feed. Kova's unit, 90 minutes compressed into 40 because the Coven's air surveillance had flagged the engagement and someone in the underground facility had made an executive decision without waiting for authorization. The Lycan formation found itself suddenly facing enemies on 2 axes. It was not a position the pack's leadership had planned for. Marc used the moment of their recalibration to cross the distance to Nadia's position, putting himself physically between her and the nearest Lycan operatives, his back to the sedan, facing out. Nadia was crouched behind the vehicle with her hands pressed flat against the cold metal and her eyes wide and alive with the specific focused terror of someone processing something real rather than shutting down. "You said not yet," she said, looking up at him. Her voice was steady. Steadier than it should have been, Marc thought, and then remembered what was in her blood and what it was doing. The activation, under the stimulus of this much threat and this much proximity to Khonshu's empowered avatar, was accelerating. Her eyes, dark a moment ago, had begun to carry a quality of light that was not reflection. "Marc," Stephen said urgently from the interior, "her biology is responding to yours. In the divine resonance, Khonshu's mark in her blood is reacting to his presence in us. This is..." "I see it," Marc said. Nadia looked at her hands. The light was there too, faint, barely visible, the cold, pale quality of moonlight finding a surface it recognized. She looked up at Marc with the expression of someone standing at the absolute edge of a revision so large it would rewrite everything. "What's happening to me?" she asked. The engagement was still ongoing around them. Kova's unit and the Lycan formation exchanging fire and violence across the motorway. Valdrris carving through the center with the focused lethality of an elder who had run out of restraint. But in the small contained space behind the sedan, the world had narrowed to this: a god's avatar and a god's marked, and the ancient resonance in her blood awakening to the proximity of its source. Marc crouched to her level, met her eyes. "Something that was always going to happen," he said. "And you don't have to face it alone." The light in Nadia's hands didn't grow. It steadied. That was the detail that told Marc the most. Not the emergence of the divine resonance, which was expected, but the quality of its expression. Not explosive, not uncontrolled, not the biological crisis that the Coven's suppressed scholarship had described as the typical activation pattern. Steady, contained, as though whatever was waking up in her blood had been waiting long enough that it knew how to arrive without destroying the vessel it had been waiting in. Khonshu was very quiet, not absent. Marc could feel the god's attention focused on Nadia with an intensity that was different from his usual imperious surveillance. Something more careful, more personal. The way a being regarded something it had invested in across a very long time and was only now seeing come to fruition. The engagement on the motorway was resolving. Kova's unit had shifted the tactical balance sufficiently that the Lycan pack's leadership, whoever was coordinating from the helicopter, whose operational calculus had been built around 2 targets and not 4, had begun the specific organized withdrawal of a force that had reassessed its position and found the math no longer favorable. The helicopter pulled altitude. The remaining vehicles began disengaging from the northern flank. The 2 transformed Lycans had not re-engaged after Marc's response and Kova's arrival. They were retreating through the eastern fields, their enormous silhouettes diminishing into the darkness with the unhurried pace of things that had decided to survive rather than win. Valdrris was standing at the center of the engagement's aftermath with the stillness of someone taking inventory of damage. 3 cuts that had mostly closed. A deep gash along his left forearm that was closing more slowly. Silver nitrate round, friendly fire from the Coven's opening volley, before Kova had apparently communicated the situation's complexity to her unit. He was looking at the retreating pack with an expression that contained several things. The professional assessment of a Lycan elder cataloging an enemy operation. The specific exhaustion of someone who had been running on vigilance for 40 years and had just spent 6 days of it in concentrated form. And underneath both, something that Marc read as relief. They hadn't taken her. Marc stood and helped Nadia to her feet, and the light in her hands had faded to the threshold of visibility. Present if you knew what to look for, invisible to anyone who didn't. She was steady on her feet, her color normal, her breathing controlled. Whatever the activation had done in those 2 minutes behind the sedan, it had not produced the catastrophic physical response the scholarship had predicted. "How do you feel?" Marc asked. She considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Like something shifted," she said. "Like a frequency I've been hearing as static just resolved into something I can almost understand." She looked at her hands, then at Marc. "Is that what it's going to be like?" "I don't know exactly," Marc said. "I'm not the right template. What's in my blood is different from what's in yours. I have Khonshu's power running through me because I accepted a relationship with him. What you have is older than that. More fundamental, less negotiated." "Less negotiated," she repeated, with a dry quality that told Marc she was processing fear through irony, which was a coping mechanism he personally found reliable. Kova appeared around the front of the sedan, her weapon holstered, her expression doing the specific work of a professional, absorbing a scenario that had significantly exceeded its operational parameters. Behind her, 2 death dealers were conducting a sweep of the engagement area. The others were tending to 2 wounded from their unit. Not fatalities, Marc noted with relief. Though the specific relief was partly about not wanting deaths on his account in a world he was still learning. "The pack withdrew," Kova said. "Confirmed. We have 3 contained, wounded, non-critical. The helicopter left Serbian airspace." She looked at Nadia with the careful assessment of someone seeing for the first time what their instruments had been describing. Then she looked at Marc. "You were supposed to have 90 minutes. "The pack didn't have the same schedule," Marc said. Kova absorbed this. Her eyes moved to Valdrris, who had walked to the edge of the road and was standing with his back to the group, looking out across the dark fields. The Elder's emissary on the operational channel had presumably been very clear about Valdriss's status. A Lycan Elder operating independently, technically hostile, practically the reason the situation had developed the way it had. She had every professional reason to move on him. She didn't move on him. Marc noted that. "The Elder wants a briefing within 2 hours, Kova said, to Marc rather than to anyone else, which was itself a statement about how the operational hierarchy had shifted in the last 40 minutes. "All parties present." A pause, weighted with professional implication. "Including the Lycan Elder, if he's willing." Marc looked at Valdriss's back. "Give me a moment." He walked to where Valdrris stood at the road's edge, the dead fields extending south into darkness, the wind moving through the stripped stalks with the patient sound of a world that had no opinion about immortal politics. The old Lycan heard him coming and didn't turn. "She's stabilizing," Marc said. "I know." Valdriss's voice was quiet. "I can hear her heartbeat from here. It's different than it was an hour ago. More resolved is the right word, I think." A pause. "What did your god do?" "He was present," Marc said. "That's apparently enough for his resonance to find its orientation. Like a compass settling when it gets near true north." He stood beside the Lycan Elder and looked out at the same darkness. "The Coven wants a meeting, you included." Valdrris was quiet for a long moment. Long enough that Marc could hear the distant sound of Kova's unit completing their sweep, the murmured coordination of professionals wrapping an engagement, the ordinary sounds of a world's hidden war continuing its administrative functions despite the extraordinary thing that had just happened. "The Elder," Valdrris said finally. "Cassia. You know her." I have been avoiding her for 60 years, Valdrris said, with a dry precision that was not entirely unlike Nadia's irony. And Marc thought about what it meant that a 23-year-old woman and a centuries-old Lycan elder had independently developed the same defense mechanism and found it did not surprise him at all. She is not like Victor, not like the elders I knew in the old hierarchy. She survived the purges by being something her predecessors were not, genuinely cautious rather than merely appearing so. She genuinely suppressed the third bloodline research because she believed the instability it would cause was worse than the suppression. Not from malice. He paused. I have not always been certain that distinction matters. Tonight I am less certain than usual. The pack that just hit us, Marc said. They weren't working for anyone in the current hierarchy? Radical faction. Young pack leadership, a generation that came up after Lucian, after the antigen facility, after the exposure events. They have no memory of the old war as it was actually fought. They have only the ideology of it. The Lycan nation, the liberation framework, the belief that any supernatural asset should be Lycan-controlled rather than Coven-controlled. Valdris's jaw tightened. They tracked Nadia's activation through the same monitoring networks I used. They were faster than I anticipated. They'll regroup. Yes, and they'll have reported her location and activation status to their broader network. Within 72 hours, there will be more of them, and they will have had time to prepare for the variables they encountered tonight. He turned to look at Marc directly, and the old eyes held the specific quality of a being making a decision about trust that was not made easily and would not be retracted lightly. The Coven's facility is defensible. Their resources for managing an activation process are genuine. Whatever I think of their historical decisions, their science is real, and their protective capacity is real. A pause. I will come to the meeting. I will not agree to Coven oversight of Nadia without conditions. But I will come. What conditions? Marc asked. That she is told everything. That no information about her biology or her options is managed or withheld. That she has genuine agency in every decision about her future. He held Marc's gaze. In the same conditions you walked onto that motorway with. Marc nodded. Those are my conditions too. They walked back together. The Coven's facility received them differently the second time. Not warmly. The institutional caution of a vampire organization was not capable of warmth in any conventional sense. And the presence of a Lycan elder walking voluntarily into their stronghold produced a quality of operational tension that manifested in the specific way death dealers held themselves when every professional instinct was saying one thing and standing orders were saying another. But the hostility that had structured Marc's initial reception was replaced by something more complicated. The careful, provisional attention of people who had watched the motorway engagement on surveillance feeds and were recalibrating accordingly. Khonshu was present in person this time. 300 years looked on her like 40. A woman of middle years with the specific quality of stillness that very old things developed. Every movement economical and deliberate. Her eyes carrying the accumulated weight of centuries in a way that her face didn't. She looked at Valdrris across the briefing room with the specific quality of attention that was the result of 60 years of mutual avoidance finally ending. And Valdrris looked back with the same. And the air between them had the density of a history that Marc only partially understood. You were right about the pack, Khonshu said to Valdrris without preamble. The radical faction has been escalating for 18 months. Our intelligence underestimated their operational capacity. Your intelligence has been underestimating Lycan operational capacity since Victor's era, Valdrris said, without heat. A statement of record rather than an accusation. Cassia absorbed this with the equanimity of someone who had spent 3 centuries learning which criticisms were worth defending against. "Yes," she said, "and nothing more." Nadia sat at the center of the table, not at the head, not at the foot, in the center, which Marc had quietly arranged because the center was the position that said, "This conversation is about me, and I am present for it," rather than the peripheral position that said, "We are deciding about you." She had her hands flat on the table, and if the faint luminescence was visible to vampiric eyes, no one commented on it. Marc sat beside her, while Valdrris sat across, and Khonshu, in the back of Marc's skull, was very quietly paying attention to all of it. The old god present in a room full of ancient things, watching the convergence of his centuries-long thread coming finally to its moment of resolution, with an attention that felt less like manipulation and more, for the first time since Marc had arrived in this world, like something that might cautiously be called hope. "I want to understand my options," Nadia said, to the room, to the elder, to all of it. Her voice was steady. "All of them. Completely. And then I want to make a choice." Cassia looked at her for a long moment with those ancient, careful eyes. "Then let us begin," the elder said. "The options, laid out completely and without management for the first time in 3 centuries of suppression, were 3. Cassia presented them with the measured precision of someone who had spent the journey from operational chaos to this table, deciding that transparency, in this specific instance, was the only viable strategic posture. Not because she had been persuaded toward generosity, Marc was clear-eyed about that, but because the room contained a Lycan elder who would immediately identify any omission, a dimensional avatar whose god apparently had independent verification capacity, and a young woman whose biology was actively responding to stimuli, in ways that suggested the window for managed disclosure had closed on the E75 motorway approximately 2 hours ago. The first option was Coven oversight, full activation conducted within the facility under scientific supervision, the process managed by their most experienced researchers. The result integrated into Coven infrastructure, with Nadia's cooperation formally documented, and her status defined as a protected asset with specified rights and limitations. The Coven's resources were genuine. Their understanding of Corvinus biology ran deeper than any institution in the world. Their protective capacity was real, and the facility they were sitting in had survived 3 centuries of immortal warfare without being successfully breached. The limitations were also genuine. Protected asset was not the same as free person. The rights and limitations Cassia described were real, but bounded. Bounded by Coven security concerns, by the political reality of managing the third expression's existence within a world that the Coven's leadership had to maintain stability over, by the institutional memory of an organization that had suppressed this bloodline for 3 centuries and was now proposing to shepherd it instead. Integration meant obligation. Protection meant oversight. The distinction between asset and ward was technical at its edges. The second option was Valdrris. Independent activation conducted outside institutional frameworks. The old Lycan elder's 4 decades of research applied to a process he had never directly managed, but understood theoretically better than anyone alive. Freedom from institutional constraints. The genuine kinship of someone who carried the same strangeness in diluted form and had survived it across a very long life. The specific value of guidance from someone whose motivation was personal rather than political. The limitations were also genuine. Valdrris had no facility, no scientific infrastructure, no protective capacity that could reliably withstand a coordinated assault from the Radical Pack or a Coven operation that decided independent activation was too destabilizing to permit. His resources were knowledge and longevity, and the specific tenacity of someone who had been running a solo operation for 40 years. Against 30 Lycans and a helicopter, those resources had their ceiling. The third option was Marc. He hadn't presented it. Nadia had. Boker looking at him across the table with the directness of someone who had spent 6 days receiving incomplete information from people with agendas, and had identified the one person in the room who had walked onto a motorway with no faction affiliation and one stated condition. "You said I deserve to hear what I am from someone who isn't trying to own it," she said. "Does that mean there's a version of this where you help me through the activation without any of..." She gestured at the table, at the Coven infrastructure, at the weight of 3 centuries of institutional history pressing down on the room. "Any of this?" Marc looked at her. Then he looked at Khonshu's absence. The god was quiet, deliberately so, and the deliberateness of it was itself information. Khonshu was not going to make this decision for him. "Honestly," Marc said, "I don't know enough about how your activation works to tell you I can manage it safely alone. My knowledge of Corvinus biology is 48 hours old." He paused. "What I can tell you is that whatever option you choose, I stay until the activation is complete and you're stable. Not as Coven, not as anyone's operative. As someone whose God put him in this world to make sure you had a choice, and who intends to see that through." The room was quiet. Cassia studied him with 3 centuries of evaluative intelligence and said nothing. Valdrris looked at the table with the expression of someone recognizing, in another person, a moral position he had once held, and had spent 40 years trying to maintain against the attrition of a world that made independent positions expensive. Nadia looked at all 3 of them, the Elder, the Lycan, Amast the Avatar, and was silent for a long moment. Then the facility's alarm system activated. Not the soft procedural alert of a scheduled drill or a perimeter sensor catching wildlife. The full tactical alarm. Red lighting flooding the briefing room, blast doors engaging at the sub-level entrances, the specific quality of organized emergency that a facility ran when it had received information that the threat was already inside the perimeter's outer edge. Doran appeared in the doorway with his weapon drawn and his expression stripped of its habitual management, down to pure operational urgency. "Elder." The Radical Pack didn't withdraw to regroup. The motorway engagement was a feint. They had a second team already in the city. They've been in position for 6 hours. They're hitting the surface entrance now. Marc was on his feet. "How many?" Kova's voice from the corridor, already moving. "Thermal imaging shows 43, plus the helicopter and 2 additional air assets." Doran's eyes moved to Marc with the specific quality of someone delivering information they needed a variable to respond to. "They have a Lycan elder with them, not one of ours. Someone we don't have on file, old, very old, moving differently from the rest of the pack." Valdrris went very still. "Describe the movement," he said. "Surveillance feed shows." Doran relayed the description in clipped professional terms, and Marc watched Valdris's face change as he listened. The careful stillness cracking open to reveal something older underneath. Not fear, the specific gravity of someone encountering a name they had hoped to never encounter again. "Varro," Valdrris said. The name landed in the room with weight. "You know him," Marc said. "He is why I've been running a solo operation for 40 years rather than building an alliance." Valdris's voice was flat and careful in the way of someone managing the proximity of something they had spent decades putting distance between themselves and. "Varro is 600 years old. He was already an elder when I was newly turned. He has spent his entire existence pursuing the position that Lycan supremacy is not merely a political goal, but a biological inevitability. that the Corvinus mutation's true expression is the Lycan form, that vampires are a corruption, and that any other expression of the bloodline is either a resource to be absorbed or heresy to be eliminated. He looked at Marc. He was monitoring the same networks I was, and he let the Radical Pact's operation run as a probe to identify the asset's location, to assess her capabilities, to draw out whatever protection she had. A pause. Us. He was drawing out us. The facility strike is the actual operation. 600 years, Stephen said internally, running the combat assessment with rapid precision. Fully transformed, that's potentially the most dangerous Lycan in this building's history. What does he want with Nadia? Marc asked. To absorb the divine resonance, Valdrris said. Not Nadia specifically. What she carries. Varro has theorized for centuries that if the third expression's full activation could be transferred rather than expressed independently, but the recipient would become something unprecedented. A Lycan elder carrying divine resonance at full activation. His expression was the specific grimness of someone describing a nightmare they had been preventing for a long time. He has been looking for a full third expression for 300 years. Every previous suppressed case, the two the Coven took, the others that disappeared before either of us found them. Varro, Marc said. Varro. The blast doors were holding, but the acoustic feed from the surface was audible even in the sub-level. The specific sounds of a large-scale assault on a fortified position, the tactical percussion of an operation that had been planned with the patience of someone who had been waiting 3 centuries to execute it. Cassia was already issuing deployment orders through her command channel, her voice carrying the cold precision of someone who had run this facility through crises before and knew exactly what her resources could sustain. 12 death dealers positioned at the 3 sub-level access points. UV flooding activated at the surface-level perimeter, which would do nothing to Lycans, but would eliminate any vampire-aligned elements in the assault force. Structural lockdown of the lower 3 levels. It was good, it was professional, and it was insufficient for 600 years of Lycan Elder moving with 43 operatives and 3 air assets. The sub-level access points, Marc said to Cassia. If Varro is as old as Valdrris says, he knows this facility's architecture. He built part of it, Cassia said, with the flat precision of someone delivering information that cost something to say. In the previous century, before the current war's parameters were established. This facility's original construction involved cooperation between Coven and certain Lycan factions that predate the modern conflict. She paused. He knows the access points we're guarding. He also knows the ones we're not. Show me the ones you're not, Marc said. Cassia looked at him for 1 second. The look of a 300-year-old vampire elder deciding, in real time, whether to trust a man she had known for less than 24 hours with information that could end her. Then she pulled up the facility schematics on the briefing room display and pointed. Marc studied the layout with the rapid spatial processing that combat had developed in him across years of urban warfare, the 3-dimensional architecture of the sub-level resolving into its tactical geometry. Beaker 3 unguarded access points. 1 maintenance shaft running from sub-level 6 to the surface, designed for equipment transfer, wide enough for a transformed Lycan. 1 historical access corridor from the original construction, sealed but not structurally modified. 1 emergency egress point on sub-level 2, thermally shielded, which explained why the facility's perimeter sensors hadn't caught the second team's positioning. The maintenance shaft, Marc said. That's the primary ingress. He'll send transformed units through first, mass, speed, shock, while the surface assault holds your death dealer's attention at the guarded points. And Varro himself? Kova asked from the doorway. "The historical corridor," Valdrris said. "He will know it's sealed. He will also know exactly what it takes to unseal it, because he was present when it was sealed." He looked at Marc. "He will come through it personally, directly to the sub-level where Nadia is." "Then that's where I need to be," Marc said. He looked at Nadia, who was standing behind the table with her hands flat on its surface and the faint luminescence visible now to everyone in the room. Not concealed, not suppressed. The divine resonance fully awake and oriented, the activation that had begun on the motorway continuing its steady, inevitable progress. She was not panicking. She was present and frightened, and absolutely refusing to be managed by the fear. "We're not leaving you here," Marc told her. "But I need you to stay behind Valdrris and follow his instructions exactly. He has been keeping people who carry what you carry alive for a very long time." "And you?" she asked. Marc picked up his truncheons. The crescent darts were live. The moon above the facility, 4 days from full, its power running clean and strong through stone and steel and the dimensional membrane between his world and this one, was a pressure against his sternum that felt, tonight, less like a leash and more like an engine. Khonshu arrived in his skull with the full weight of a god who had stopped being patient. "He is old," the pale traveler said. "He is strong. He has been making himself strong for 6 centuries specifically for this moment. Do not underestimate him as the others have." "I don't underestimate anything that's been preparing for 600 years, Marc said quietly. "Good. Then go and remind this world what it means when the night has an owner." The historical corridor's sealed entrance was on sub-level 3, a section of the facility that the current Death Dealer deployment had left with minimal coverage. Exactly as Varro's 6-century-old knowledge of the architecture would have predicted. Marc reached it 90 seconds ahead of the acoustic signature of the seal beginning to fail. He stood in the corridor's darkness, truncheons ready, crescent darts lave. The moonlight gathered around him in that sourceless wrong way that predators slowed to look at and waited. The seal gave. Varro came through the darkness like something the darkness had made. 600 years of Lycan elder in his full transformation. Not the explosive violence of the young pack's aggression, but something worse, something deliberate. The specific quality of a being that had been moving toward this moment across 3 centuries and had all the patience of something that did not experience time the way mortals did. He was enormous, and he was fast, and his eyes in the darkness were the amber of something that believed completely in what it was. He saw Marc and stopped. Not from fear, from the same recalibration that every predator in this world performed when it encountered Khonshu's mark. The animal recognition of something in the hierarchy above them. The instinct that said wrong, wrong, this is wrong before the conscious mind had time to override it. Then the conscious mind overrode it. Because Varro had 600 years of experience overriding instinct in service of ambition. He came. Marc moved to meet him. The collision was seismic. Divine empowerment and 6 centuries of Lycan biology meeting in a narrow corridor at full commitment, neither side offering anything held back. Marc took the first strike on crossed truncheons and felt the force travel up both arms and into his shoulders like a controlled detonation, managed, distributed, the impact catastrophic but not shattering. He drove back into it with the full lunar-enhanced strength at his disposal, the crescent dart at his right wrist raking across the Lycan elder's forearm in a cut that would have ended a younger creature and produced a snarl of genuine pain from Varro. Pain, not stopping. Pain. 6 centuries. Marc reset his stance and felt Khonshu flooding the channel to its absolute maximum. Not the measured empowerment of a careful deity managing his avatar's sustainability, but the full commitment of a god who had decided this moment warranted everything. The moonlight in the corridor had no source and no explanation, and filled the space with cold silver fire. And in that light, Marc Spector was not merely a man who had been given power by a deity. He was the physical expression of what it meant for Khonshu to exist in this world. The embodiment of a god's claim, ancient and absolute. The divine Marc made mobile and purposeful and utterly without negotiation. He went at Varro with everything. The corridor became a crucible. Varro fought the way 6 centuries of survival produced, not with the explosive aggression of youth or the reckless commitment of ideology, but with the terrible patience of something that had outlasted every opponent it had ever faced simply by being more willing to absorb damage and continue. He was not faster than Marc. He was not more powerful in the immediate exchange. What he was sustainable in a way that most opponents weren't. The Lycan Elder's biology regenerating damage at a rate that turned the corridor's confined geometry from a liability into a strategy. Wear the avatar down, outlast the divine empowerment. Wait for the moment when the god's channel flickered. Marc understood this within 30 seconds of the engagement's opening exchanges and adjusted. He stopped trying to end it quickly. Jake Lockley surfaced in the interior with the flat professional calm of the 3 altars' most dangerous expression. Not Marc's soldier's intensity or Stephen's intellectual precision, but the specific quality of a man who had learned his trade in the kind of environments where survival required the complete elimination of emotion from the decision matrix. Jake didn't fight angry. Jake didn't fight scared. Jake fought with the dispassionate efficiency of someone treating violence as a technical problem, requiring a technical solution. He regenerates fast, Jake assessed, watching the cuts from the crescent dart close in real time. But not instantly. There's a window between damage and recovery. 2 seconds on deep tissue, 4 on joint damage. We need to stack impacts within those windows. Don't give him the recovery interval. Marc gave him the controls. The change in fighting style was visible, the truncheon work becoming faster and more precise. The strikes targeted specifically at the joint structures that governed the Lycan Elder's mobility rather than the mass strikes designed to produce shock. Knee joint, elbow joint, the complex architecture of the shoulder where the transformation's mass concentrated its leverage. Each strike landing before the previous site had finished closing, the cumulative disruption building faster than Varro's regeneration could fully address. Varro felt the shift. He was old enough to recognize when an opponent had changed the game's terms, and old enough to adapt. He pulled back 2 steps, changing the corridor's geometry, on forcing Marc to close distance rather than maintain the current exchange rate. In the 2-step retreat, he got 3 recoveries. His eyes in the cold silver light were calculating rather than raging, the amber intelligence of something running its own adaptation in real time. He was good. He was genuinely, historically good. And Marc was honest enough with himself in the middle of the exchange to acknowledge it fully. "He's trying to get past you," Stephen said urgently from the interior. "He doesn't need to beat you. He just needs to get through this corridor to the sub-level where Nadia is. Every exchange he's drawing out is an exchange where his operatives are working on the access points above." Jake registered this simultaneously. He's not fighting to win. He's fighting to create a window. Marc changed again. He stopped defending the corridor and started driving, not the careful joint targeting approach of the last 90 seconds, but aggressive forward pressure, closing the distance and staying inside it, removing Varro's ability to disengage and redirect. The truncheons became constant, the crescent darts supplementing them at intervals designed to prevent the Lycan Elder from finding the stance he needed for a clean break. Varro had to fight now rather than maneuver, had to commit to the exchange rather than manage it, because the alternative was being driven backward into the sealed entrance he'd come through. This was what Khonshu's gift was for. Not the raw power, though the raw power was real, but the combat intelligence that came with it. The moon's clarity applied to violence, where the ability to read an opponent's geometry and respond before the intention became action. The divine perception that turned fighting from reaction into anticipation. Varro swiped at Marc's head with the full force of a 6th-century-old Lycan elder in complete transformation. The kind of strike that would have removed the head from anything that hadn't spent years learning to not be where incoming force expected it to be. Marc wasn't there. He was already inside the arc, one truncheon driving upward under the extended forearm at the precise angle that hyperextended the elbow joint against its own momentum, the crack of the impact reverberating in the corridor's stone. And as Varro's arm buckled, Marc drove the second truncheon into the junction of neck and shoulder with the full accumulated force of Khonshu's empowerment behind it. Circa not a killing blow, designed not to be, but carrying enough force that the Lycan elder went down on one knee, the regeneration running hard and visibly, the amber eyes flickering for the first time with something other than calculation. Marc stood over him with both truncheons raised, and the cold silver light gathered around him at its fullest expression and waited. Varro looked up. 6 centuries of survival looked back at Marc with the specific quality of a being doing the calculation that survival always eventually required. The calculation of whether continuing was viable. Not whether he could eventually win. Whether continuing, right now, produced outcomes better than stopping. He was doing that calculation when the sound from above changed. The assault on the facility's surface had not been going well for the Radical Pack. Kova's unit, reinforced by the Coven's full deployment and fighting in their own fortified space with the defensive advantages of a facility designed specifically for this kind of engagement, had held every guarded access point. The air assets had been disrupted by the facility's countermeasures. UV emitter arrays on the roof that couldn't harm Lycans but could blind the helicopter's sensors. Electronic warfare packages that Cassia's technical team had apparently been maintaining for exactly this scenario. The 43 operatives of the Radical Pack were experienced and committed, and were losing ground against a defensive force that knew every centimeter of the terrain. And Valdrris had gone up. Marc hadn't expected it, hadn't had time to anticipate it in the press of the corridor engagement. But somewhere in the tactical calculus of the last several minutes, the Lycan elder who had spent 40 years running a solo operation had made a decision about what this moment required. The acoustic feed from the upper levels carried the specific quality of a Lycan elder at full expression engaged in combat, and it did not sound like someone defending a position. It sounded like someone ending one. Varro heard it too. The calculation in those amber eyes completed. "It's over," Marc said, not triumphant, quiet, the statement of a man delivering a factual assessment. "Your second team is failing above us. Your primary objective is between me and you, and I'm not moving. And the elder you sent 600 years of patience to outmaneuver is currently dismantling your operational capacity floor by floor." He held Varro's gaze in the cold silver light. "You are not getting to Nadia tonight." Varro was silent for a long moment. The regeneration had mostly completed, the elbow joint functional again, the shoulder damage closing, and his biology had brought him back from the edge of incapacitation with the thoroughness that 6 centuries of accumulated healing capacity produced. He could fight again. Marc could see him knowing that, and could see him also knowing what the second exchange would cost and what it would produce. "You are not of this world," Varro said finally. His voice in transformation was deep and resonant with a quality that was not quite human speech. On the Lycan elder's vocal architecture handling language in a register that bypassed the ears and addressed something more fundamental. You will not always be here. No, Marc agreed. I won't. Then this changes nothing. She exists. She will continue to exist. And what she carries will eventually come to its conclusion without a divine guardian standing in the way. The amber eyes were cold and patient and entirely without the rage that younger things brought to defeat. I have waited 3 centuries. I can wait longer. You can, Marc said. But she'll spend those centuries knowing what she is and making her own choices about it. And that changes every calculation you've been running. He paused. The world you're trying to build, where the third expression is absorbed rather than expressed, requires her not knowing her options. She knows now. That door is closed regardless of what happens tonight. Varro looked at him for 3 seconds. Then he moved, not at Marc, not toward the sublevel. Backward, through the broken seal, into the darkness of the historical corridor, with the specific controlled retreat of something that had decided to survive and recalculate. Marc let him go. Not from weakness, not from uncertainty. Because Varro retreating was the correct outcome. Not his capture, not his elimination, but his departure from a situation he could not win tonight, carrying the knowledge that the strategic landscape had permanently changed. Killing him would have produced a martyr and a successor. Defeating him completely, in front of his own operatives and with his objective unachieved, I produced something more valuable. The specific damage to a 6th century reputation that came from being stopped by someone who hadn't existed in this world 24 hours ago. Marc stood in the corridor for a moment after Varro disappeared into the dark, breathing, running inventory. The lunar channel was still open but depleting. The extended combat at maximum empowerment had drawn down the moon's reserves in the way that sprint running drew down a sprinter's legs, functional but needing recovery. His ribs from the motorway tackle reported their continued objection. His arms felt the specific deep ache of sustained high-force impact work. None of it was stopping him. All of it was information. He went back to Nadia. She was in the briefing room with Valdrris, Lycan, who had returned from the upper levels, moving carefully around a deep puncture wound in his left side that was closing with the slowness of something that had hit something vital before missing everything critical. He was sitting rather than standing, which from a Lycan elder of his generation said something specific about the cost of the last 30 minutes. But he was present and conscious, and when Marc came through the door, his eyes conducted the rapid assessment of a professional who had spent 40 years making these evaluations and found what he was looking for. "It's done," Marc said. Valdrris nodded. Nadia looked at him with the expression of someone who had spent the last 40 minutes in the specific suspended terror of waiting for an outcome she couldn't influence, and was now processing the release of it. "Varro?" Valdrris asked. "Gone, for now. He will return." "Yes," Marc said. "But the situation he returns to will be different from the one he left." He looked at Nadia. "How are you?" "The activation," she said. "While you were, it kept going. Whatever started on the motorway." She looked at her hands. The luminescence was soft and steady, fully present now without fluctuation. The divine resonance settled into its expression like something that had found its correct form after a very long search. It doesn't feel like something happening to me anymore. It feels like something that was always there, that I'm just seeing clearly now. Khonshu arrived in Marc's skull with a quietness that was nothing like his usual imperious presence. The god of the moon and night travelers, in this moment, was something older and more careful than the deity who had been dragging Marc across dimensional barriers and delivering cryptic directives since this began. "She is well," Khonshu said. And the 3 words carried more weight than any of the gods' elaborate pronouncements had managed. "The resonance has found its expression. She is what she was always going to be." "What is she?" Marc asked, quietly enough that only he heard it. "Mine," Khonshu said. And then, with the specific precision of a god being honest, "and entirely her own. Both things are true. Both things have always been true." Marc looked at Nadia, this young woman who carried a god's fingerprint in her blood and had spent the last 6 days discovering that the world was larger and stranger and more dangerous than she had been equipped to understand. Herman had responded to that discovery not with collapse, but with the steady insistence on knowing and choosing that had been present in her from the first moment on the motorway. She was going to be remarkable. He was privately entirely certain of that. The Coven facility's full operational assessment took 3 hours. The Radical Pack had taken significant losses and withdrawn completely before dawn. Varro's historical corridor had been resealed with materials that Cassia's technical team had been developing for exactly this kind of structural vulnerability for 30 years. The Elder, it turned out, had known the corridor existed and had been waiting for someone to eventually use it. Marc filed that piece of information about Cassia's operating style away with the rest of what he had learned about her. 300 years of survival had produced a leader who prepared for contingencies she hoped would never arrive, and deployed those preparations without visible emotion when they did. The negotiation about Nadia's future took 4 hours and produced something that none of the 3 parties had entered the facility proposing. Not Coven oversight, not Valdrris's independent arrangement, not Marc's provisional accompaniment. A framework, loose and new and requiring ongoing negotiation, in which Nadia's activation process would be supported by Coven scientific resources voluntarily accessed rather than institutionally imposed, with Valdrris present as an independent advisor, but with her agency over every decision formally documented and structurally protected. It was imperfect. Cassia had reservations she expressed precisely and then formally set aside. Valdrris had concerns he articulated clearly and then agreed to monitor rather than prevent. Nadia had questions that neither the Elder nor the Lycan Elder could fully answer, which she accepted as the condition of being the first full expression of something that had never been allowed to fully express before. Marc watched the framework being built and thought about what it had cost to build it, the motorway, the corridor, 40 years of Valdrris's solitary mission, 3 centuries of suppression, 2 universes worth of divine intention, and found that the cost, tallied honestly, was not nothing. But the thing that had been built with it was real. At dawn, he found a quiet corner of the facility's lowest level and sat with his back to the cold stone and let the accumulated toll of the last 24 hours settle into his body, with the honest accounting it deserved. Khonshu came without being called. "You got what you wanted," Marc said. "I got what I needed," the god corrected. "They are different things, as you know better than most. What happens now, with your resonance in her? Does she become your avatar? Does she owe you something?" "She owes me nothing," Khonshu said, with a certainty that Marc found, cautiously, provisionally, genuine. The resonance is a mark, a recognition. What she does with it is entirely her own choice. I am a god of travelers, Avatar. I do not keep people from moving. I keep them safe while they do. "And this world?" Marc asked. "You have a mark here now, a living expression of your presence. Does that mean you have jurisdiction here? Does that mean you're going to be sending more people through?" The god was quiet for a moment, that had the quality of genuine consideration rather than strategic pause. This world has its own order, Khonshu said finally, its own powers and hierarchies and wars. I do not need to own what I have simply touched. Nadia carries evidence that I existed here. That is enough. That has always been enough. A pause. For now. Marc didn't miss the qualification. He never missed Khonshu's qualifications. I need to go home, Marc said. Yes, Khonshu agreed. You do. When? When you are ready. The way back is available. I will not rush you. And Marc sat with that for a moment. The unusual quality of a god offering patience without condition. And found that it didn't make him trust Khonshu more. But it made him trust this specific moment more, which was its own smaller and more honest thing. He went to find Nadia before he left. She was in the facility's upper research level, sitting with Valdrris over the digitized archive materials. The two of them working through the suppressed scholarship with the focused attention of people who had just been told they were the subject of 3 centuries of research and intended to understand every word of it. The Lycan elder's wound had mostly closed. The divine resonance in Nadia's hands was steady and soft in the morning light coming through the facility's narrow high windows. She looked up when Marc came in. You're leaving, she said, not a question. My world, Marc said. My responsibilities, and... He paused. You don't need me here anymore. You have what you need. She stood, looked at him with those dark eyes that now carried their own faint quality of light, the divine resonance fully integrated, fully expressed, fully hers. Tell your God, she said carefully, that I know what I carry, and I know who put it there, and I intend to decide for myself what it means. She held Marc's gaze steadily. Can you deliver that message? Marc almost smiled. He's listening right now. He heard you. In the back of his skull, Khonshu was very quiet, and the quality of the quiet was the thing that Marc would remember longest from this world. A god receiving the independence of someone he had marked, and accepting it, and finding in that acceptance something that might, which can a deity's vast and complicated interior, be called satisfaction. Marc Spector pulled on his white suit, checked his crescent darts, picked up his truncheons, and walked out of the Coven's Budapest facility into a November morning that was cold and gray, and ordinary in the way that mornings after extraordinary nights always were. He looked up at the sky. The moon was there, invisible behind the daylight, present in the way it was always present, his compass, his power source, his employer's eye. 4 days from full. He was ready. Marc Spector returned to his own world carrying something he hadn't brought with him. Not a wound, not a trophy, but the specific weight of a thing witnessed and completed. A god's centuries-long thread, woven through an impossible bloodline, had found its expression in a young woman who had responded to the revelation of her own extraordinary nature, with the insistence on agency that Marc recognized from the inside out. He had been Khonshu's instrument in this, as he was always Khonshu's instrument. But he had also been himself. The part of the equation that the god had never fully controlled and had learned, perhaps, to stop trying to. Nadia Voss would activate fully over the following months, under the imperfect but genuine framework that had been built in a facility conference room at dawn, after a night of motorway combat and corridor battles, and 3 centuries of suppression finally running out of room. Valdrris would be present. The Coven's science would be available. The Radical Pack would regroup, and Varro would recalculate, and the Immortal War would continue its long, hidden existence beneath the surface of a human world that mostly didn't know. But the third expression existed now, fully, undeniably on its own terms, not absorbed, not suppressed, not owned. And somewhere in the architecture of divine jurisdiction, in the space between universes where gods held their long accountings, Khonshu marked this world's coordinates and filed them under something he rarely needed to use: